Hello, this is Robert Stevenson. I'm here with Jonathan Bassett. He is a professor of psychology here at Lander University, and we're going to discuss death on the small screen. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Robert.
How you
Good
doing?
to talk with you. Doing great. Good to be here.
So, I don't know if we're going to just jump around, but I was intrigued to find out that you've been interested in this topic for quite a while. As a youngster, you were interested in mortality.
Yeah. It's something I guess I've always been fascinated by, and my brother and I always grew up, watching. We liked anything with monsters or
Kung Fu
and martial arts, and so we've always had kind of a long-standing interest in violence in television and in mortality. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You discuss in your book this sort of dichotomy between taboo mortality, yet interest, really more than just interest,
Yeah. fascination
with
Right,
violence.
sure. And so that's not an original insight from me, but a lot of previous people have noted the fact that in Western culture they call death as taboo or invisible death, and a lot of reasons for that, going back to the rise of the professional funeral industry, increases in medical technology, but people just don't tend to die at home. They die off screen, pun intended, in an institutional setting, and then the funeral service comes in and deals with the body. So in Western industrialized cultures, we just have very little exposure to actual death and actual dead bodies. And so one theory is then that mass media stepped in to gratify this kind of curiosity about that taboo, and that's where you get such a proliferation of images of death in mass media. And my focus is on television, but it actually goes back pre-television. There used to be the penny dreadfuls and the drawings and newspaper stories about executions and murders and all these things. So it's a longer standing phenomena than just TV. But TV is where I sort of pick it up.
That reminds me of old westerns. When they hung somebody, they had crowds come from all over.
Yeah, and that's somewhat different, because there you don't have the fantasy element to it, right? So it's
right.
you know there's one thing to consume images of violence and death when you know they're not real and nobody's really being hurt, but there was a historical appetite for voyeurism at executions and actual kinds of images of death.
So the book will be coming out this month.
It's coming out this month. The deadline keeps shifting. I was hopeful it was going to be next week, and now it's maybe the 14th, but definitely in October it'll be available. So,
and where can folks get this?
Yeah, so they can get it any major distributor of books. So it'll be on your Barnes & Noble, your Amazon.com, all your big major websites where you buy
and they can go
books.
now and read the back page?
Yeah, so on the publisher's McFarland Press out of North Carolina, and you can go to their webpage, or it's also on Barnes & Noble and those sites. You can pre-order it if you want to, but you can also read the description, table of contents, all that kind of stuff.
So this was the product of a sabbatical.
Yeah. So it's really great that Lander has brought back sabbaticals not too long ago, and I was very lucky to have one. It was actually during the semester where COVID kind of hit the hardest, and we all went into online teaching.
That's
so
right.
I was sort of absolved of that experience because I was on sabbatical. I wasn't teaching, but that did make it easier to stay on my. There wasn't a lot of distractions since we were quarantined at home. It was easy to force myself to do the writing. But yeah, we have a pretty high teaching load here at Lander, as you know, with teaching 4 classes in the fall and 4 in the spring, and so it really is hard to do this kind of scholarship without a little bit of help like the sabbatical.
Sure.
So that was a big push. One of the arguments I make in the book is that part of the appeal of watching violence in television. In a way, it could be comforting, is that it doesn't necessarily indict society as somehow sick or craven, that we all have this subconscious bloodlust that we have to gratify in fantasy, which there were. Going back to Aristotle, there was this notion of catharsis, and that somehow, if we watched all this nasty stuff in fantasy, it would quell our own impulses towards it. But most modern psychology has kind of refuted that and shown if anything, watching violence can make us more aggressive.
Mm.
The point of the book, though, is not really to demonize violent television as the main cause of real world aggression, although you do have some occasional copycat kind of scenarios. As you were saying, you and I watch a lot of violent television, and yet we're pretty meek, mild folk. And in fact, hundreds of millions of people consume lots of violence in television, and yet actual aggression is really a rare event. So it's not to say that violent television can't, in some cases, make people aggressive, but that's really not the focus of my book. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So you talked about psychological theories, and that's something I'm not familiar with. What are some? There was a theorist that you.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. So the main theory that drives the book goes back to Ernest Becker, who was a cultural anthropologist. He wrote a book. I'm looking over there, somewhere over there, in my favorite books. But he wrote a book in 1973 called "The Denial of Death." Ironically, he was dying of cancer.
Wow.
Didn't know it when he wrote the book, but he died before it was published. It won a Pulitzer Prize posthumously. Okay. So Becker's work influenced it, and then in the 1990s there were three social psychologists, Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pazinski, who translated Becker's anthropology into testable hypotheses in psychology, and that's what's come to be known as terror management theory. And so those are the two things that drive the book. But the basic idea is that what people have to deal with that other animals don't is the awareness of mortality, right? So all living things are going to die, but most of them are lucky enough not to know it.
That's a good point.
And so people have to live with that awareness, and it could be, potentially debilitating, but it's not. Like, most of us are able to go out and function and not worry about the fact that we're going to die. And so the reason Becker and terror management theory say that we can do that is because of culture. So in their view, what's unique about people from other animals is that we have culture.
Okay.
So there's some argument that other animals have language, or maybe, but they don't have iPads, and they don't have TV, and they don't make culture. And so the terror management says that's not a coincidence. People know they're going to die. People have culture. Other animals don't know they're going to die. They don't have culture. So culture is the human solution to the problem of death. And it allows us to sort of conceptualize how our lives are going to be more meaningful and offer some kind of transcendence in the way that, a sea cucumber or a possum or some other animal won't have that same level of transcendence.
Now, as a teaser to the folks that are already planning on ordering your book, tell us some of the TV shows that you looked at.
Oh yeah, so basically, there's nothing interesting about these shows other than the fact that it's sort of what I was watching, right? So why did I pick these shows? Well, because I really liked these shows, and I was interested in what do I find captivating or challenging about them. So Game of Thrones, of course, is probably the most popular show that I deal with, and I know House of Dragons is going on right now. I have not yet gotten into that, but I guess I will.
Is that a sequel?
I will soon. That's the sequel on
Okay.
HBO now. But Game of Thrones is a show I look at. The other's the FX show Sons of Anarchy, which is about motorcycle gangs, which you might not find immediately compelling, but there are some interesting kind of moral dilemmas and questions about morality and masculinity that show raises in an interesting way. The other two are Marvel, our comic book shows, which superheroes are all the rage, but these were Netflix takes on the Marvel universe, which are now all defunct, but for a while there they had a lot of things going. So The Punisher and Jessica Jones are two of the comic book series on Netflix I look at. And the last one was on NBC, so it was the only sort of network show that I looked at, but it was very kind of cutting edge, very radical for network TV, and that's this show Hannibal. It only had 3 seasons. It was not quite as popular viewership-wise as the others, but got a lot of interest from critics, and so that one I really chose because I've always been fascinated with that character of Hannibal, and in fact, I think that's why in 1992 when I showed up at Furman with a declared psychology major, I think it was in large part because of the popularity of the first Silence of the Lambs movie at the time.
I remember that well.
Yeah.
Right now, I've been hearing some of my students talking about the Jeffrey Dahmer show.
I've not seen it, but it's coming out, right? Or just out. I forget what platform it is, but it does look interesting.
Yeah, I think it's Netflix.
And the other thing that's popular along with the serial killers is the podcast about murder. Like true crime is just really popular, and I guess Hannibal is the closest I get to that. I don't really address true crime, but I think a lot of things I talk about in the book are relevant. I don't think the fact that there's so many people who are going to watch the Dahmer series suggests that there's cannibalism is a rampant social problem, but a lot of it has to do with trying to develop a sense of mastery. And so we want to learn about serial killers so we can try to not be victims of violence, and that gives us a sense of comfort there.
Yeah, good point. Research for this. Now this goes way back. You've done some work from.
Yeah, so I started. Gosh, I don't know when the first. I'm trying to think of what the first TV show or book I did, but it started with my attendance at these regional popular cultural conferences. Okay. So there's a group called the Popular Association for Pop Culture in the South, and so I started going to those conferences, and I would just present on one show that year, and so over time I just accumulated all these kinds of papers looking at in depth one of these shows, and then the idea came, well, I could package this all into a book. So it's probably been about the last 12 years. In many ways, I've been working on this book. So it took the sabbatical to get it kind of done, but it's not like I wrote the whole book in 6 months. I had really been writing parts of it for many years.
See, I asked a question, then I immediately asked another one about when did you start, but anything that came out particularly surprising or milestone?
No, I mean, I had this concept in mind that from a terror management standpoint, the reason we're drawn to death and violence and mayhem in media is really as kind of a psychological defense to help us. It's easier to grapple with it in that realm than it is to grapple with the reality of more prominent causes of death like cancer.
Right.
And so the great thing about violent death is you can imagine ways to avoid it and how it won't happen to you, which is why we say death is prevalent in mass media, but it's not really. It's just violent death. There's not a lot of coverage of more mundane death.
Sure.
And even when it is, it's always in the context of a medical drama where, yeah, occasionally
Right.
you're going to lose a patient, but most of the time, medicine and science are going to come in and save the day. So
That's a good point.
as much as there's death in this, I'm really arguing that consumption of violent media really serves to help us suppress and deny our mortality in a kind of an ironic way.
Right. That makes sense. So, do you bring any of this into the classroom?
Sometimes, yeah. So sometimes, in fact, I've taught it primarily as a summer course, but would love to be able to. Some of the times, what we teach is just mandated by the needs of the department curriculum. But if I could get to teach it more often, I would. I taught a course on the psychology of horror, and so a lot of the stuff that I write about in the book comes out of research specifically on horror. But then I've just generalized it to violence in other, action films, your CSI, crimes, dramas. It generalizes to a lot of other stuff, but a lot of what I'm writing about did come out of research on horror.
Okay, just as a way to wrap things up, is there anything that you want to say to the folks that are considering getting the book?
Yeah, I think it appeals to a lot of a lot of potential readers. So one thing I want people to know is it's not just a television is bad for you kind of book. I'm a person that loves television. I'm actually a fan of a lot of the shows I write about. So if you're a fan of these shows, or if you're a fan of these genres of shows, like you said, you might read the book and decide maybe I need to start watching these shows. So I think for people who like television and like action, shoot 'em up, superheroes, horror, those kind of genres, this will be of interest to you. For people who may just have a more kind of interest in the problem of violence, I think there's something in here for you. I think there's something in here about just our attitudes about death as a culture and sort of how we get more comfortable talking about it. So I think it's a good read to a lot of different audiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if you're watching this and you wished I would have asked another question, there's a comment section below, and go ahead and put your question in there. See if we can get that answered. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great. I appreciated talking with you.
It was
Fantastic.
a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I have 5 more shows I'm going to watch.
That's great. Yeah, excellent.